Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following presentation, encompassing this deep dive into the intersection of family law, specifically the historical context surrounding divorce, and its representation throughout United States theater history, is intended strictly for educational, informational, and historical entertainment purposes only. The information provided in this series does not, under any circumstances, constitute professional legal advice, financial counsel, therapeutic guidance, or formalized academic instruction. Marital dissolution, family law proceedings, and the legal frameworks discussed, including any historical or modern references to statutes, codes, or legal services such as those colloquially known in California as Divorce 661, are highly complex and subject to continuous legislative changes. Viewers must conduct their own thorough due diligence, research historical trends independently, and consult with licensed legal professionals in their specific jurisdiction before making any personal, financial, or legal decisions regarding marriage, separation, or divorce. We will be examining case studies, historical archives, and potential outcomes of societal shifts as reflected on the stage, but nothing in this content should be interpreted as a substitute for certified legal representation. Picture the scene. It is the winter of 1890. The gaslights of a packed Broadway theater dim, casting long flickering shadows over an audience of New York's most elite socialites, influential critics, and working-class theatergoers crammed into the steep, stifling upper galleries. The air is thick with anticipation, the smell of heavy wool, tobacco, and expensive perfume mingling in the heat of the auditorium. The heavy velvet curtain rises, and within the first act, a line of dialogue is spoken that will not only halt the performance but will trigger a near riot, summon the local police constabulary, and send shockwaves through the highest courts of the American legal system. A female character standing center stage looks directly at her husband and demands a legal separation. This was a concept so deeply taboo, so aggressively censored by the moral arbiters of the era, that uttering the word on a public stage was considered an act of profound social treason. This was not just a play. It was a cultural detonation, a moment where the polite fiction of American domesticity collided violently with the hidden reality of fractured households. For decades, the United States theater operated under a strict, unspoken, and often legally enforced moral code. Marriage was depicted exclusively as an unbreakable, sacred institution. Any narrative that suggested otherwise was systematically dismantled by critics, suppressed by local magistrates under public decency laws, and boycotted by powerful religious organizations. Yet, beneath the surface of this manufactured theatrical purity, the American public was secretly grappling with a massive domestic crisis. The Industrial Revolution, the relentless shift toward urbanization, and the changing economic realities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were destabilizing traditional family structures at an unprecedented rate. The reality of domestic life was violently clashing with the idealized, sanitized fiction presented on the stage. This is where the phenomenon we are exploring today truly begins. When we discuss the historical trajectory of marital dissolution in the performing arts, we are not merely talking about dramatic plot devices or entertaining storylines. We are analyzing the exact mechanism by which a silenced society learned to articulate its deepest legal and personal struggles. We are looking at the foundational moments that eventually paved the way for modern family law frameworks, including the highly streamlined, administrative approaches to separation that we see today in modern legal systems. The journey from that scandalous late 19th century performance to the modern bureaucratic reality of no-fault divorces, standardized legal filings, and specialized paralegal services is paved with intense censorship, artistic rebellion, and landmark legal battles that fundamentally changed the fabric of the United States. Consider the sheer gravity of the historical trends we are about to unpack. In the early days of American theater, playwrights who dared to feature a divorce character had to adhere to strict, unwritten rules to avoid having their productions shut down by the authorities. The playwright had to ensure that the divorce character was thoroughly vilified, permanently exiled to Europe, or met a tragic, usually fatal, end before the final curtain fell. The potential outcomes for an actor portraying a divorcee were equally severe, often resulting in complete ostracization from reputable acting troupes and polite society. The stage was a mirror, but it was a heavily distorted mirror, strictly controlled by conservative factions who understood a fundamental truth. If the public saw divorce normalized and survived in the theater, they would eventually demand its normalization in the courtroom. The breaking point arrived with the slow, controversial infiltration of European realism into the American theatrical landscape. When Henrik Ibsen's masterful play, A Doll's House, finally crossed the Atlantic, its depiction of a woman willingly walking out on her husband and children terrified the American establishment. American producers initially panicked, going so far as to completely rewrite the ending to force a happy reconciliation, terrified of the legal and social backlash. However, the eventual staging of the original uncompromising ending marked a seismic shift. It opened the floodgates for American playwrights like Langdon Mitchell, whose 1906 comedy, The New York Idea, brilliantly used sharp wit and high society satire to mask a devastating critique of America's chaotic, hypocritical divorce laws. Mitchell demonstrated that if you could make an audience laugh at the absurdity of the legal system, you could bypass their moral defenses and force them to think critically about legislative reform. What you are about to experience in this comprehensive 10-part masterclass is a meticulous step-by-step deconstruction of this exact cultural and legal evolution. We will analyze the historical case studies of specific plays, daring playwrights and fearless actors who risked their careers, their reputations, and their personal freedom to drag the reality of marital dissolution out of the shadows and into the spotlight. You are going to learn how the theater served as the ultimate testing ground for American legal reform, acting as a shadow legislature where the boundaries of family law were debated through dialogue and blocking long before they reached the steps of the Capitol. For the modern viewer, understanding this history is not just an academic exercise. It solves a crucial problem in how we comprehend our current legal and social landscape. Millions of people today interact with the family court system, navigating complex filings, mediation processes, and paralegal frameworks, without ever realizing the centuries of intense cultural warfare that made these modern conveniences possible. By examining the theatrical history of divorce, you will gain a profound, structural understanding of how societal taboos are systematically dismantled. You will see the exact strategies that artists and legal minds use to shift public perception from moral outrage to administrative acceptance, a transition that directly mirrors the evolution of legal code. We will break down the data behind theater attendance during these controversial productions, cross-referencing it with the historical trends of divorce filings in major metropolitan areas like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles during the same periods. You will discover how specific theatrical movements directly correlated with localized spikes in legal separations, and how the emotive language used on stage eventually found its way into actual legislative chambers and judicial rulings. We will explore the hard economic factors that drove theater producers to finally abandon the moral high ground in favor of sensational, deeply human stories about broken marriages, recognizing that the public appetite for truth was vastly more profitable than the enforcement of outdated morality. By the end of this exhaustive journey, you will possess a master-level understanding of the symbiotic, often combative relationship between American entertainment and American law. You will be able to trace the lineage of modern legal services, jurisdictional rules, and procedural codes directly back to the dramatic climaxes of forgotten Broadway plays. This is not a surface-level overview. We are going deep into the historical archives, examining the original prompt books, the suppressed manuscripts, the court transcripts from obscenity trials, and the private, closely guarded correspondence of the theatrical pioneers who forced a nation to confront the reality of divorce. You will learn how to identify these historical patterns in modern media, giving you a highly critical lens through which to view today's entertainment and its potential influence on future legal trends. This knowledge provides a massive strategic advantage for anyone interested in history, jurisprudence, cultural studies, or the mechanics of social change, equipping you with the vital context needed to understand exactly how the unthinkable becomes the ordinary. To understand how the unthinkable becomes the ordinary, we must first transport ourselves back to the rigid theatrical and legal landscape of the late 19th century. Under the strict fault-based legal systems governing marital dissolution during this era, a plaintiff could not simply cite irreconcilable differences or a mutual desire to part ways. They were legally obligated to publicly prove severe, undeniable transgressions. This meant providing the courts with verifiable evidence of adultery, protracted desertion, or extreme physical cruelty. The burden of proof was astronomical, requiring multiple witnesses, humiliating public testimonies, and a complete surrender of private domestic life to aggressive public scrutiny. The theater, firmly bound by the moral policing and obscenity laws of the era, was forced to replicate this exact judicial rigidity on the stage. From our modern vantage point in the year 2026, where an average citizen like John Doe might initiate a streamlined administrative separation process, often colloquially referenced in certain legal spheres through procedural identifiers like a divorce 661, the past seems almost entirely incomprehensible. Imagine if John Doe, attempting to finalize a peaceful mutual separation today, was subjected to the same public theater required in 1895. Imagine if the very act of filing those standardized legal forms was considered a dangerous assault on the fabric of American society. In the late 19th century, playwrights were not merely artists. They were forced to act as amateur legal scholars and careful risk managers. When writing a script that involved a fractured marriage, they had to meticulously construct scenes that provided undeniable, stage-proven evidence of legal fault. If a character was to legally leave their spouse, the playwright had to spend 3 agonizing acts clearly establishing the other party as an irredeemable monster. If the antagonist was not sufficiently villainous, the powerful theater licensing boards would immediately revoke the production permit, citing the promotion of social anarchy and the degradation of public morals. The potential outcomes for a producer attempting to stage a nuanced, amicable separation were disastrous. They faced the immediate closure of their venue, severe financial ruin, and the very real threat of criminal charges under local public decency statutes. We can observe fascinating historical trends when we map theater attendance during this period against regional legal filings and state-by-state censorship laws. Let us examine a historical case study of the massive Broadway touring circuits, as they moved from the slightly more liberal hubs of the East Coast into the deeply conservative territories of the American Midwest. Producers literally carried 2 entirely different versions of the same script to avoid arrest. One version, intended for progressive metropolitan audiences, might softly imply that a divorced character could eventually find peace and rebuild their life. The alternative version, strictly mandatory for heavily censored districts, featured an aggressively rewritten final act where the divorced character suffered a fatal illness or total destitution, ensuring the audience left with the legally approved moral lesson. This dual script system perfectly illustrates the profound geographical divide in American legal consciousness. The playwrights were essentially forced to write 2 parallel universes, one where a citizen had a microscopic sliver of legal recourse, and another where the unbreakable doctrine of 19th century marriage law remained absolute and terrifyingly supreme. However, as the dawn of the 20th century rapidly approached, a massive economic and demographic shift began to destabilize this moral monopoly. The relentless urbanization of the United States created a massive new class of theatergoers. These were working professionals facing the unprecedented pressures of dense city life, extreme economic instability, and the rapidly shifting dynamics of gender roles in the industrial workforce. They were living the harsh, complicated realities that the stage systematically refused to acknowledge. Theater syndicates and powerful producers, driven by the ruthless capitalism of the entertainment industry, began to realize that the sanitized, legally approved depictions of flawless marriages were no longer generating sustainable revenue. The public appetite for reality, however scandalous or legally taboo, was becoming significantly more profitable than the enforcement of outdated morality. To bridge this highly dangerous gap between what the law legally permitted and what the paying public demanded, playwrights developed a sophisticated method of covert ideological warfare through the genre of high society comedy. By setting tales of complex marital discord exclusively among the absurdly wealthy elite, artists created a crucial psychological buffer for the censors. Audiences could watch characters casually discuss legal separations, complex asset division, and the exploitation of jurisdictional loopholes without feeling a direct threat to their own middle-class values. They could laugh at the frivolous romantic entanglements of the upper class, easily dismissing the scandalous behavior as a mere byproduct of excessive wealth and endless free time. Yet, beneath the safety of the laughter, a profound structural shift was actively occurring in the American consciousness. By cloaking the grim reality of legal separation in glittering dialogue and expensive stage designs, the theater effectively smuggled the concept of divorce past the rigid moral gatekeepers. Thousands of citizens were walking into theaters every single night and absorbing a highly radical legal concept. They were watching characters survive a process that the state deemed spiritually and legally fatal. The stage was essentially running massive public simulations of potential outcomes that the contemporary judicial system absolutely refused to acknowledge or accommodate. These performances functioned as an unauthorized shadow curriculum, educating the American public on the mechanics of marital dissolution long before specialized family courts, mediation services, or no-fault doctrines ever existed. We can deeply analyze the prompt books and heavily redacted, suppressed manuscripts from these early comedic productions, and traced the exact evolution of the American legal vocabulary. The initial dialogue surrounding separation was heavily coded, utilizing vague euphemisms and metaphors to avoid triggering immediate legal repercussions. But year by year, the language grew sharper, the character motivations became distinctly more recognizable, and the arguments presented on the stage began to sound remarkably identical to the legal arguments that would eventually echo through the chambers of the highest appellate courts decades later. The theater was successfully normalizing the conversation, practically demonstrating that society would not immediately collapse if a marriage legally and administratively ended. But this highly effective strategy of comedic subversion possessed one massive critical flaw. Comedy inherently allowed the audience to distance themselves from the genuine emotional and financial devastation of the actual legal process. It presented marital dissolution as a fast-paced, chaotic farce rather than a deeply complex structural and legal transition. For the theater to truly shatter the foundational bedrock of United States family law and force genuine legislative reform, someone was going to have to intentionally drop the protective comedic mask. A playwright was going to have to place the raw, unvarnished, brutal reality of a failing American marriage center stage, completely devoid of high society glamour or witty repartee. They would have to force the audience, the powerful theater critics, and the entrenched legal establishment to look directly at the catastrophic human cost of their draconian legal codes. This necessary, inevitable pivot would require a theatrical production willing to endure the full, terrifying wrath of the censorship boards, face the very real threat of criminal prosecution, and risk absolute financial annihilation simply to tell the truth. This singular event would set off a catastrophic chain reaction of litigation, public outrage, and artistic rebellion, forever altering the trajectory of American jurisprudence and setting the stage for the modern legal frameworks we recognize today. But who possessed the sheer audacity to launch this devastating cultural strike, and what unprecedented, terrifying chaos erupted when the curtain finally rose on the most dangerous, heavily policed play in United States history? The answer to that profound historical question lies in the brutal, unflinching rise of American dramatic realism in the early 1910s, a movement that violently stripped away the comedic safety nets and exposed the darkest, most hypocritical open secret of the United States legal system. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this theatrical explosion, we must deeply analyze the specific legal trap that ensnared millions of citizens during this era, a trap defined by a legal doctrine known as collusion. Under the draconian family law statutes prevalent in heavily populated jurisdictions like New York, mutual consent to end a marriage was not just legally unrecognized, it was actively criminalized. The state mandated that for a marriage to be dissolved, one party had to be a pristine, innocent victim, and the other had to be a demonstrable, undeniable villain who had committed a severe statutory offense, almost exclusively limited to the act of adultery. Imagine if a modern citizen, let us call her Jane Doe, living in the year 2026, realized her marriage had simply run its natural course. Today, Jane Doe could quietly download standardized administrative forms, utilize streamlined legal services to file an uncontested dissolution, and peacefully untangle her financial and domestic life without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom. Now, project Jane Doe back into the suffocating legal reality of 1912. If she and her husband approached a judge and honestly stated that they mutually wished to separate because they were fundamentally incompatible, their case would be immediately dismissed, and they could potentially face severe legal penalties for attempting to defraud the institution of marriage. The law demanded a villain, and if a villain did not naturally exist, the law practically forced the couple to invent one. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and bizarre historical trends in American jurisprudence, a trend where the justice system itself inadvertently created a massive underground theatrical industry. Because the state required verifiable proof of infidelity, desperate couples who simply wanted to peacefully separate were forced to stage elaborate, highly scripted fictional scenarios. They hired professional actors, often struggling performers recruited directly from the theater districts, to play the role of the anonymous lover. They rented cheap hotel rooms, orchestrated precise timing, and hired private detectives and fake witnesses to burst through the door at the exact right moment to catch the husband in a highly choreographed, entirely simulated act of betrayal. The United States legal system had essentially forced ordinary citizens to become amateur playwrights, directors, and performers just to escape their own legal confinement. The courtroom had become a stage, and the judges were unknowingly reviewing heavily rehearsed theatrical performances disguised as legal testimony. The terrifying chaos that erupted on Broadway occurred when a fearless faction of realist playwrights decided to take this absurd, legally mandated perjury, put it exactly where it belonged, under the glaring, undeniable spotlight of the public stage. When the curtain rose on this new breed of uncompromising drama, audiences were not greeted with witty banter or high society mansions. Instead, they watched a grim, meticulous step-by-step recreation of the legal divorce mill. They watched a husband and wife, exhausted and broken, quietly negotiating the logistics of a fake hotel raid. They watched the husband hand cash to an out-of-work actress to sit on a bed and pretend to be his mistress. They watched the agonizing psychological toll of a legal system that forced fundamentally honest people to commit perjury, destroy their own reputations, and participate in a humiliating public farce just to attain basic personal freedom. The reaction from the establishment was immediate, visceral, and overwhelmingly hostile. This was no longer a covert ideological battle hidden within a comedy. This was a direct, aggressive assault on the integrity of the American judicial system. The theater was explicitly demonstrating that the strict fault-based divorce laws were not protecting the sanctity of marriage. They were actively manufacturing deceit, corruption, and systemic perjury. The moment the audience saw their own hidden, shameful legal realities accurately reflected on stage, the polite fiction of the era completely collapsed. Police constabularies were dispatched to physically barricade theater entrances. Powerful religious coalitions mobilized by the thousands, demanding that municipal governments immediately revoke the operating licenses of any venue daring to host such seditious material. Playwrights and producers were threatened with severe financial ruin and potential outcomes that included lengthy prison sentences for violating aggressively broad public decency and morality statutes. We must closely examine the case studies of the actors who dared to perform these roles. Taking on the character of a woman demanding a realistic, unvarnished legal separation was an act of profound professional suicide. These performers were subjected to relentless public smearing, their names dragged through the conservative press, and their personal morals viciously attacked by the very lawmakers who enforced the corrupt laws they were protesting on stage. Yet, despite the massive police presence, the continuous threats of arrest, and the coordinated blacklisting campaigns, the public flooded the box offices. The sheer demand to witness the truth was unstoppable. Working-class citizens, trapped in their own inescapable domestic realities, stood in freezing lines for hours just to catch a glimpse of the reality the state was desperately trying to suppress. This was the critical tipping point where the theater transcended mere entertainment and became the most powerful engine for legal reform in the nation. By forcing the public to look directly at the grotesque machinery of the staged hotel raids, the theater effectively destroyed the moral high ground of the conservative legal establishment. Lawmakers could no longer pretend that their rigid statutes were preserving domestic bliss, when the most popular plays in the country were explicitly exposing how those same statutes were turning citizens into criminals and courtrooms into theaters of lies. The language of reform began to organically shift from whispered, back-alley conversations into loud, undeniable demands for a system that recognized mutual administrative separation, laying the absolute foundation for the no-fault divorce movements that would take decades to fully materialize. However, the powerful institutions that controlled the legal and moral narrative of the United States were not going to surrender their authority simply because a few brave playwrights exposed their hypocrisy. The exposure of the divorce mills triggered a massive, highly coordinated counteroffensive from the most entrenched, well-funded conservative political machines in the country. They realized that attacking the plays directly was only increasing their popularity, so they decided to completely change their tactics. They bypassed the local censorship boards, ignored the theater critics, and launched a terrifying, unprecedented legislative strike aimed at the very heart of the American entertainment industry, utilizing legal weapons so obscure and powerful that they threatened to permanently extinguish free expression on the stage. How exactly did the federal government attempt to weaponize interstate commerce laws to completely eradicate the discussion of family law from the theater? And what legendary clandestine legal maneuver did the Broadway syndicates execute to survive total annihilation? To execute this unprecedented federal crackdown, conservative lawmakers resurrected and weaponized a series of terrifyingly broad postal and interstate commerce regulations originally designed to combat the physical distribution of illicit contraband. They realized that while they might struggle to ban a play about marital dissolution locally in a progressive city like New York, they could completely destroy the financial viability of that play the second it attempted to leave the state. The entire American theatrical industry during this period operated on a centralized touring model. A production would establish its reputation on Broadway and then generate its actual profit by loading sets, costumes, and actors onto trains and embarking on exhaustive, multi-year national tours spanning the entire continent. By classifying scripts that depicted realistic, non-villainous legal separations as fundamentally obscene materials, federal prosecutors began threatening railway companies and touring syndicates with catastrophic felony charges for transporting immoral goods across state borders. This was an astonishing legal escalation. The government was no longer just targeting the artists, they were targeting the massive industrial infrastructure of the United States. They threatened to impound train cars, arrest stagehands, and seize the financial assets of any theatrical management company that dared to export the conversation of family law reform into the deeply conservative heartland. Imagine if a modern citizen, John Doe, operating in the year 2026, created an entirely educational digital platform explaining the administrative mechanics of an uncontested separation, perhaps outlining the precise filing steps of a modern divorce 661. Now imagine if the federal government classified the data packets transmitting his video across state lines as a federal crime, threatening the internet service providers hosting his platform with total asset seizure simply because the educational content conflicted with the moral preferences of a specific geographic region. The chilling effect would be instantaneous and absolute. This was exactly the terrifying reality facing the theatrical syndicates of the early 20th century. The potential outcomes of defying these federal injunctions were not merely fines. They included the total, permanent dismantling of the largest entertainment monopolies in the country. Facing absolute financial annihilation, the brilliant, ruthless legal minds representing the Broadway syndicates engineered one of the most legendary and clandestine maneuvers in United States legal history. They realized they could not win a direct, frontal assault against federal interstate commerce laws or heavily entrenched local obscenity ordinances. Therefore, they decided to completely change the legal definition of what an audience was. They turned to the United States Constitution, specifically leveraging the deeply protected rights of private assembly and the formation of exclusive social clubs. The syndicates instructed their touring producers to enact a massive, overnight legal illusion. When a touring production of a controversial play dealing with marital dissolution arrived in a heavily censored city, and the local police constabulary inevitably arrived to nail a closure notice to the theater doors, the producers did not argue. They simply closed the theater to the general public. In the shadows, within mere hours, the production company would legally dissolve its status as a public entertainment venture and instantly incorporate as a private, closed-door literary and educational society. The box office was immediately shut down. You could no longer walk off the street and purchase a ticket to see a play. Instead, citizens were quietly informed through underground networks that they could purchase a membership subscription to a newly formed private organization dedicated to the serious sociological study of modern domestic issues. This clandestine legal pivot was a masterpiece of jurisdictional judo. Obscenity laws and public decency statutes of the era were almost exclusively written to govern public spaces, public exhibitions, and public thoroughfares. They had absolutely no legal jurisdiction over what adult citizens voluntarily chose to discuss or witness behind the locked doors of a privately funded, members-only association. When the local magistrates and vice squads attempted to raid these performances, they were met at the theater doors by highly paid syndicate lawyers wielding freshly inked private club charters, politely informing the police that they were attempting to illegally trespass on a private educational gathering. Let us analyze the profound historical trends this single maneuver triggered. By forcing controversial plays about divorce into the private club model, the conservative establishment accidentally created an air of absolute exclusivity and intense intellectual rebellion. The demand to see these suppressed plays skyrocketed exponentially. Citizens who might never have attended a standard public melodrama were now desperate to pay premium membership fees just to participate in this legally protected act of cultural defiance. The theater owners realized they were making vastly more money operating as underground private societies than they ever did as public entertainment venues. The plays became infinitely more dangerous, more realistic, and more analytically aggressive toward the hypocrisy of American family law precisely because they were now shielded by the ironclad protections of private assembly. The stage became a literal safe house for the advancement of modern legal theory. Inside these private performances, playwrights abandoned all remaining comedic metaphors and began presenting airtight, devastating case studies of the systemic corruption inherent in fault-based divorce. They staged meticulous recreations of backroom judicial bribes, the psychological destruction of women trapped in legally inescapable marriages, and the catastrophic financial ruin that the state mandated for anyone attempting to honestly dissolve a domestic partnership. The audiences, sitting in the dark as newly minted members of these subversive literary clubs, were receiving a masterclass in the necessity of legal reform, completely insulated from the moral panic raging in the streets outside. Furthermore, these exclusive audiences were not merely passive observers. They were the wealthy elite, the voting middle class, the very citizens who would go on to serve on juries in actual family court proceedings. The theater syndicates were effectively running a massive, legally protected campaign to pollute the conservative jury pool. Once a citizen had sat in a private theater and watched a brilliant, logical deconstruction of why a marriage must sometimes administratively end, it became entirely impossible for local prosecutors to rely on those same citizens to convict individuals in real-world divorce mills. The cultural foundation of the rigid fault-based system was silently crumbling from within, dismantled night after night behind the velvet ropes of these private literary societies. The powerful municipal machines and conservative legal leagues were entirely humiliated. Their attempts to crush the conversation had only weaponized it, turning casual theatergoers into deeply invested, highly organized advocates for the very legal reforms they were trying to suppress. The private club loophole was hemorrhaging their authority, and they recognized that as long as the theaters possessed an airtight legal defense for assembly, the movement toward normalizing marital dissolution would inevitably bleed out from the stage and infect the actual courtrooms. They needed a completely new strategy, a weapon that could bypass the constitutional protections of private assembly and physically destroy the syndicate's ability to operate, regardless of whether a performance was public or private. They realized they could no longer attack the ideas, they had to attack the physical architecture of the theaters themselves. What deeply corrupt, entirely unrelated municipal codes did the establishment suddenly weaponize to forcefully evict these productions, and how did a catastrophic real-world tragedy completely alter the battlefield and permanently change the way the United States viewed the concept of safety, both physical and domestic? To bypass the ironclad constitutional protections of private assembly, the conservative municipal authorities realized they had to completely abandon their moral and obscenity-based arguments. They could no longer send the vice squads to break down the doors of these private literary clubs, so they deployed a far more insidious and legally unassailable weapon, the municipal building inspector. In a highly coordinated, nationwide effort, local governments began weaponizing arcane fire safety regulations and urban zoning codes to systematically suffocate the theatrical syndicates. They argued that these underground, closed-door performances, which often packed hundreds of eager citizens into heavily modified, privately rented spaces to view controversial plays about marital dissolution, represented an extreme and immediate physical hazard to the public infrastructure. The strategy was devastatingly effective in its administrative simplicity. A local fire marshal would arrive at a theater operating as a private club just hours before the curtain was scheduled to rise. They would not mention the scandalous dialogue regarding divorce, nor would they utter a single word about family law reform. Instead, they would meticulously measure the width of the aisles, inspect the heavy velvet curtains for municipal fireproofing stamps, and scrutinize the placement of the emergency exit doors. Because these private performances were explicitly designed to keep the general public and local police out, the syndicates routinely utilized heavy chains and padlocks on the primary auditorium doors during the performance to prevent unconstitutional police raids. The fire marshals legally cited these locked doors as catastrophic safety violations, immediately revoking the building's certificate of occupancy and physically evicting the actors, the producers, and the private audiences onto the street under the unassailable guise of public welfare. This bureaucratic warfare might have successfully crushed the theatrical movement entirely, had it not been for a horrific, real-world catastrophe that abruptly and violently shifted the entire national consciousness. During this exact historical era, the United States suffered a series of devastating, high-fatality urban fires, most notably within heavily crowded industrial factories and large-scale public entertainment venues. These catastrophic events were characterized by a singular, recurring nightmare, hundreds of innocent citizens perishing not directly from the flames, but because the exit doors had been chained shut by management to prevent unauthorized entry or theft. The public was completely traumatized. The entire nation became aggressively focused on the concept of structural safety, and the image of a locked exit door became a universal symbol of corporate negligence and preventable human tragedy. The brilliant playwrights and strategic legal minds behind the American theater syndicate seized upon this national trauma and executed one of the most profound ideological pivots in cultural history. They took the terrifying visceral reality of the locked fire exit and transformed it into a devastating legal metaphor for the American marriage under fault-based legal systems. They began rewriting their scripts to explicitly draw parallel lines between physical safety and domestic safety. Imagine if a modern citizen, Jane Doe, living in the year 2026, recognized that her domestic environment had become profoundly toxic and psychologically dangerous. Today, she has access to streamlined administrative off-ramps, perhaps utilizing a standardized Divorce 661 procedural filing to securely and swiftly exit the partnership, ensuring her fundamental safety and autonomy. Now, project Jane Doe back into the suffocating legal reality of 1915. The stage plays began to loudly ask the audience a highly uncomfortable question. If it is a severe criminal offense to lock a citizen inside a burning building with no legal means of escape, why does the state legally mandate that a woman must remain locked inside a violent, dangerous, or fundamentally broken marriage unless she can undergo the humiliating, nearly impossible task of proving her husband committed adultery? The theater explicitly argued that the rigid fault-based divorce laws were the legal equivalent of padlocking the fire exits on the American family. By weaponizing the fire marshals against the theaters, the conservative establishment had accidentally handed the reform movement the exact vocabulary they needed to win the ideological war. The conversation surrounding marital dissolution permanently shifted away from religious morality and concepts of spiritual purity, and became entirely focused on human safety, psychological survival, and fundamental bodily autonomy. Audiences were no longer watching plays about scandalous society women seeking frivolous separations. They were watching terrifying psychological thrillers about citizens desperately trying to survive a legal system that structurally prevented their escape from catastrophic domestic environments. We can analyze the historical trends of family law jurisprudence from this period and see the direct, undeniable influence of this theatrical narrative. As the plays became more intense, focusing heavily on the physical and psychological toll of inescapable marriages, the legal arguments presented in actual courtrooms began to mirror the dialogue from the stage. Progressive legal scholars and early family law attorneys started introducing concepts like extreme mental cruelty and constructive desertion into their actual court filings, attempting to broaden the definition of legal fault to include domestic environments that were fundamentally unsafe. The theater had successfully retrained the American jury pool to view the denial of a divorce not as the protection of a sacred institution, but as an act of profound state-sponsored cruelty. The syndicates leaned heavily into this new safety narrative, aggressively advertising their private performances not as scandalous entertainment, but as vital public safety seminars focusing on the hidden dangers of the modern domestic sphere. They effectively checkmated the municipal building inspectors. When the fire marshals arrived to shut down a production, the producers immediately alerted the newly formed, highly influential progressive press, framing the eviction as a deliberate attempt by corrupt politicians to silence vital conversations about domestic violence and women's safety. The establishment found themselves trapped in a massive public relations nightmare, actively perceived as the villains desperately trying to keep the fire exits locked. However, the powerful, deeply entrenched factions fighting against family law reform possessed immense financial resources, and they realized that ideological warfare and municipal building codes had failed to stop the momentum. They understood that to truly kill the movement, they had to destroy the very individuals who were physically delivering the message every single night. They shifted their focus away from the producers, the playwrights, and the theater buildings, and launched a highly personalized, viciously destructive campaign aimed directly at the most vulnerable participants in the entire theatrical ecosystem. What deeply archaic, highly punitive contractual weapons did the establishment suddenly unleash to financially and socially annihilate the leading actresses of the era? And how did these women orchestrate a massive, unprecedented labor uprising that forced the courts to redefine the fundamental legal rights of the American worker? To understand the exact nature of this deeply archaic, highly punitive contractual weapon, we must examine the specific legal architecture of theatrical employment during the early 20th century. The weapon deployed by the conservative establishment was the morality clause, a broad, legally ambiguous stipulation embedded into the contracts of nearly every working actor, but enforced almost exclusively against women. Under these draconian agreements, theater syndicates possessed the absolute dictatorial authority to instantly terminate employment, seize all back pay, and issue industry-wide blacklists if a performer engaged in any conduct deemed publicly scandalous, legally immoral, or contrary to the rigid traditional doctrines of American domesticity. The powerful municipal leagues and conservative political machines realized they could completely bypass constitutional protections of free speech and private assembly by simply attacking the livelihoods of the artists delivering the message. They began aggressively pressuring the wealthy theater owners and financial backers, threatening massive economic boycotts unless the syndicate strictly enforced these morality clauses against the leading actresses starring in the progressive, realist plays about marital dissolution. The establishment created a terrifying, inescapable ultimatum for the women of the stage. If an actress dared to step into the spotlight and accurately portray a woman demanding a legal separation, or worse, if her own personal life mirrored the complexities of the domestic struggles depicted in her art, she faced immediate, total professional annihilation under the guise of a standard contractual breach. Imagine if a modern professional, let us call her Jane Doe, operating in the year 2026, recognized that her domestic environment had become fundamentally unsustainable and opted to utilize a standardized, administrative legal framework, such as the procedural filings colloquially known as a Divorce 661, to safely and legally untangle her household. Now imagine if her corporate employer, bowing to immense pressure from external political action committees, abruptly terminated her employment, permanently froze her pension, and utilized a massive corporate syndicate to blacklist her from her entire industry, citing a vaguely worded morality clause from her initial hiring paperwork. This terrifying systemic loss of personal agency and financial independence was the exact crushing reality faced by the leading women of the American stage. Their ability to earn a living, feed their families, and participate in the public sphere was held entirely hostage by their strict public conformity to fault-based marital laws. However, the conservative establishment vastly underestimated the profound resilience, strategic brilliance, and immense public influence of these leading actresses. Instead of retreating into submission and abandoning the progressive plays that were shifting the national consciousness, these women orchestrated a massive, highly covert labor movement right under the noses of the syndicate bosses. They utilized the dressing rooms, the backstage corridors, and the highly transient nature of the Broadway touring circuits as secure, unmonitored command centers. They began systematically communicating with stagehands, lighting technicians, musicians, and chorus members, building an unprecedented cross-discipline labor coalition that spanned the entire continent. The actresses recognized a fundamental economic truth that the wealthy moral leagues had entirely ignored. The conservative politicians did not produce the product, and the syndicate owners did not produce the product. The actors themselves were the indispensable product, and without their physical labor, the grand, heavily policed theaters were nothing more than empty, bankrupt buildings. The boiling point arrived when a powerful syndicate management group, acting on direct orders from a prominent conservative vice squad, attempted to formally enforce a morality clause to fire a highly celebrated actress specifically because of her association with a play dissecting the hypocrisy of American family law. The trap the actresses had meticulously built was instantly sprung. They executed a highly coordinated, nationwide, and completely unprecedented walkout. They did not simply strike for higher weekly wages or better dressing rooms. They struck for fundamental legal autonomy and the total eradication of the morality clause from the American workplace. They publicly demanded the absolute right to separate an employee's personal domestic status, as well as the legal themes of the artwork they performed, from their fundamental right to participate in the commercial workforce. We can look at the historical trends of this exact moment and witness the immediate, catastrophic economic paralysis of the United States entertainment monopoly. Theaters in every major metropolitan hub went completely dark overnight. Millions of dollars in box office revenues evaporated instantly. Train cars loaded with expensive sets and costumes sat rotting in rail yards across the Midwest. The actresses established massive picket lines directly outside the locked theaters, brilliantly leveraging their immense celebrity to dominate the daily press cycle and win the ideological war in the court of public opinion. They explicitly framed their massive labor stoppage not as a petty contract dispute, but as a sweeping human rights campaign. They articulated to the American public that the right to a fair, uncooperative workplace was inextricably linked to the right to escape a toxic, legally inescapable marriage. By fighting the morality clause, they were actively destroying the financial mechanisms that kept women trapped in dangerous domestic environments. The sheer, overwhelming economic devastation caused by the dark theaters eventually forced the powerful syndicates to the negotiating table, resulting in a landmark legal capitulation that completely redefined the rights of the American worker. The ensuing arbitration boards and labor courts were forced to legally acknowledge that morality clauses could not be arbitrarily weaponized by employers to enforce highly subjective religious doctrines or outdated family law standards. This massive, hard-fought victory established a crucial foundational firewall between an individual's professional employability and their private domestic reality. It fundamentally paved the way for modern labor protections, ensuring that a citizen could navigate complex family court proceedings without the inherent, terrifying threat of state-sponsored professional excommunication. The leading actresses of the American theater had successfully defended the stage, secured their own financial independence, and proved that highly organized collective action could shatter even the most deeply entrenched, heavily funded moral monopolies. The theatrical space was now permanently secured as an unassailable fortress for progressive legal thought, and the vital normalization of marital dissolution continued to broadcast to millions of eager citizens every single night, completely free from the threat of contractual sabotage. However, the deeply entrenched conservative political machines, completely humiliated by their sweeping defeat at the hands of a theatrical labor coalition, realized that fighting this cultural war on a city-by-city, contract-by-contract basis was a fundamentally losing strategy. The public appetite for legal reform had grown too massive, and the theaters were now fully protected engines of social change. If the establishment could not stop the progressive plays locally, and they could not financially starve the actors individually, they knew they had to escalate the conflict to the absolute highest tier of the United States government. They completely abandoned the municipal courts and the local labor boards, setting their sights directly on Washington. What terrifying, sweeping federal legislative monster did they attempt to engineer to permanently outlaw the very concept of administrative divorce across the entire nation? And how did a highly obscure, forgotten constitutional loophole become the final apocalyptic battleground for the future of the American family? The terrifying, sweeping federal legislative monster engineered by the conservative establishment was nothing less than an attempt to completely eradicate state sovereignty over family law through a draconian national marriage amendment. Recognizing that they were violently losing the cultural war in the theaters and failing to maintain their grip on municipal labor boards, conservative political action committees descended upon Washington with a singular, apocalyptic goal. They sought to amend the United States Constitution to permanently standardize marriage and permanently outlaw any form of mutual, administrative marital dissolution across all 50 states. They wanted to build an impenetrable federal fortress around the fault-based divorce system, ensuring that no citizen, no matter where they lived or what progressive local government they elected, could ever escape a marriage without proving severe, legally verifiable malicious conduct. To achieve this total federal domination, they had to destroy a highly obscure, often overlooked constitutional loophole that had quietly become the ultimate weapon for theatrical syndicates and progressive legal scholars alike: the full faith and credit clause. Found in Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution, this clause mandates that every state must respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. For decades, this clause had slept quietly in the background of American jurisprudence. But as the theater began aggressively normalizing the concept of separation, desperate citizens and brilliant legal minds realized that if they could physically reach a state with lenient, progressive family laws, and secure a legal separation there, their deeply conservative home states would be constitutionally forced to legally recognize that separation under the full faith and credit clause. Imagine if Jane Doe, a modern citizen navigating the legal system in the year 2026, realizes she needs to initiate an amicable separation. Today, Jane Doe can simply access standardized local resources, utilizing procedural off-ramps like a modern Divorce 661 filing right in her home county, expecting immediate local jurisdiction and administrative efficiency. Now imagine Jane Doe living in the stifling legal reality of 1922 New York, where such mutual filings were considered criminal fraud. To secure her freedom, she had to become a domestic refugee. She had to pack her bags, board a transcontinental train, and physically flee thousands of miles across state borders to newly established legal sanctuaries in Western territories like Nevada. This desperate cross-country flight for legal survival birthed an entirely new, wildly subversive theatrical genre that completely hijacked Broadway: the migratory drama. Playwrights abruptly stopped setting their narratives in claustrophobic New York drawing rooms or dark, oppressive courtrooms. Instead, they began setting massive, multi-act productions on moving transcontinental locomotives. The theater syndicates invested astronomical sums in groundbreaking stagecraft, utilizing complex rotating backdrops, massive hydraulic platforms, and deafening steam whistle sound effects to physically simulate the journey westward. Audiences were no longer just watching a debate about legal reform. They were being invited on a thrilling, high-stakes escape mission to the frontier. The historical trends triggered by these migratory dramas were absolutely unprecedented. The plays meticulously documented the absurdity of geographical morality. Center stage audiences watched characters who were considered absolute legal pariahs in Manhattan cross an invisible, arbitrary state line in the American West and instantly become free, autonomous, highly respected citizens under Nevada law. The playwrights brilliantly exposed a terrifying philosophical flaw in the conservative argument. If an act is considered a severe moral abomination in New York, but perfectly legal and administratively sound in Reno, then the law is clearly not based on universal divine truth. It is merely a man-made, geographically arbitrary map designed to control the immobile working class. We must examine the case studies of the immense economic boom these theatrical productions generated. The plays functioned as massive, highly effective advertising campaigns for Western legal sanctuaries. They provided audiences with exact, step-by-step details on how to navigate the train routes, how to establish the mandatory 6-week residency requirements in these frontier towns, and how to interact with the local frontier judges. As ticket sales for these Broadway train dramas skyrocketed, actual railway ticket sales to Western states experienced a massive, highly correlated statistical surge. The theater was literally moving the United States population. They were actively bleeding the deeply conservative Eastern establishment of their wealthiest, most influential citizens, who were taking their capital and fleeing westward to purchase their legal freedom. The establishment in Washington panicked violently. They realized the theater was no longer just polluting the jury pool. It was actively funding a massive, highly lucrative legal tourism industry in rival states. In a desperate counterattack, federal prosecutors attempted to draft sweeping anti-enticement laws, attempting to classify these Broadway plays as illegal, interstate commercial advertisements for rival jurisdictions. They argued that because the plays clearly detailed the legal processes of Nevada and Wyoming, they violated federal postal and wire laws by promoting legal services across state lines without federal authorization. The federal government was literally trying to make it a felony to accurately describe the laws of another state on a public stage. However, the conservative establishment's master plan to ram the National Marriage Amendment through Congress and crush the full faith and credit clause collided with a brutal, unexpected economic reality. The Western states, now fiercely wealthy and rapidly expanding due entirely to the massive influx of legal tourists sent to them by Broadway playwrights, adamantly refused to ratify any federal amendment that would destroy their primary economic engine. The theater syndicates had essentially checkmated the federal government by making the concept of administrative separation far too profitable for the Western Bloc to ever surrender. The theatrical promotion of the migratory divorce had permanently fractured the political unity required to pass a constitutional amendment, ensuring that the legal sanctuary loophole remained wide open for decades. The stage had achieved the impossible. It had survived local censorship, defeated municipal fire marshals, crushed the morality clauses through massive labor strikes, and successfully stalled a federal constitutional amendment by weaponizing interstate economics. The American theater had cemented itself as the undisputed, unconquerable fortress of progressive family law reform. The normalization of marital dissolution was now a permanent fixture of the American cultural landscape, and the archaic fault-based legal systems were bleeding credibility by the hour. Yet, as the theatrical syndicates celebrated their monumental victory over Washington, a chilling silence fell over the conservative war rooms. The deeply entrenched moral leagues, completely humiliated and legally paralyzed, realized they had been fighting the wrong war. They understood that the stage, while powerful, was ultimately limited by the physical capacity of the auditorium and the geographical reach of the touring trains. But looking out across the rapidly changing technological landscape of the late 1920s, the establishment saw a terrifying new frontier emerging from the laboratories. They realized a new medium was being born, one that required no physical theater, no tickets, and no constitutional protections of private assembly. What was this unprecedented technological monster that threatened to beam the subversive concept of legal separation directly into the living rooms of millions of citizens simultaneously? And what draconian ironclad censorship code did the establishment rush to construct to completely suffocate this new media before it could ever speak? The unprecedented technological monsters that emerged to terrify the conservative establishment were the advent of synchronized sound and motion pictures, universally known as the talkies, and the explosive, unregulated growth of national radio broadcast networks. For decades, the moral leagues and conservative political action committees had desperately tried to contain the subversive theatrical discussions of family law reform by physically attacking the geographical locations of the theaters, padlocking the doors and harassing the touring train lines. But as the 1920s bled into the 1930s, they suddenly faced a horrifying new reality. They were no longer fighting a localized, physical battle against stagehands and theatrical syndicates. The conversation regarding marital dissolution, mutual separation, and the escape from fault-based domestic traps was about to be digitized, recorded onto celluloid and vinyl, and broadcasted simultaneously into millions of living rooms across the entire United States. The theater syndicates had required months to slowly tour a progressive play across the Midwest, but radio and film could deliver that exact same radical legal ideology to the entire voting population of the country in a single evening, completely bypassing municipal fire marshals, local vice squads, and the constitutional protections of private assembly. To completely suffocate this new media before it could normalize the concept of administrative legal separation on a massive scale, the deeply entrenched establishment engineered one of the most draconian, ironclad, and aggressively enforced censorship frameworks in global history, commonly recognized as the Motion Picture Production Code. The architects of this code understood that they had catastrophically lost the ideological war on the legitimate Broadway stage, so they resolved to build an impenetrable moral fortress around the silver screen and the radio waves. The code explicitly mandated that the sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home had to be upheld at all times. It dictated with terrifying legal precision that no film or broadcast could ever infer that low forms of sex relationship, including mutual, faultless marital dissolution, were the accepted or common thing. If a cinematic adaptation of a progressive stage play dared to feature a character seeking a legal separation without proving undeniable, villainous fault, the Production Code Administration would simply refuse to issue a seal of approval, rendering the film entirely illegal to distribute or screen in any major theater chain in the country. Imagine if Jane Doe, a citizen navigating the complexities of family law in the year 2026, decided to search for educational media regarding a peaceful mutual separation. Today, she could instantly stream hundreds of highly detailed, step-by-step tutorials outlining exactly how to execute a modern administrative filing, perhaps utilizing a streamlined legal process like a Divorce 661, completely free from moral judgment or state-sponsored propaganda. Now, project Jane Doe back into the suffocating, highly controlled media landscape of 1934. If she went to the cinema seeking validation or guidance for her failing marriage, she was subjected to a mandatory, federally backed psychological operation. Every single film she watched was legally required to depict separated or divorcing individuals as tragic failures, social pariahs, or irredeemable villains. The state had effectively weaponized mass media to completely overwrite the progressive legal realities that the Broadway stage had spent 30 years painstakingly building. We must deeply examine the historical trends and the devastating case studies of what happened when the great, radical American stage plays were purchased by the emerging Hollywood studio system. The film studios, desperate for proven narrative material, offered astronomical sums of money to Broadway theatrical syndicates to secure the rights to the very same migratory dramas that had successfully blocked the National Marriage Amendment. But the moment those brilliant, subversive scripts entered the studio system, they were systematically butchered by the Production Code administrators. The sharp, logical dialogue deconstructing the hypocrisy of geographical morality was completely erased. The empowering, triumphant endings where characters successfully utilized interstate legal sanctuaries to achieve personal autonomy were aggressively rewritten. Under the strict mandate of the code, a female character who successfully attained a legal separation on stage had to be severely punished when transferred to the screen. She was legally required by the censors to suffer a complete financial collapse, contract a terminal illness, or, in the most egregious ideological reversals, realize the fundamental error of her ways and return crying to the abusive husband she had rightfully left in the original theatrical production. This draconian censorship created a massive, unprecedented cultural schism in the United States, effectively splitting the American consciousness into two entirely different legal realities. On one side was the sanitized, state-mandated fiction of mass media, where the archaic fault-based marriage laws were depicted as flawlessly functional and morally absolute. On the other side stood the legitimate Broadway stage, which abruptly became the absolute last remaining bastion of uncensored legal truth in the entire nation. Because the theater relied entirely on live, localized performance and operated under the hard-won labor protections of the actor strikes, it remained completely immune to the federal broadcast regulations and the Motion Picture Production Code. Citizens rapidly realized that if they wanted to understand the actual gritty reality of family law, asset division, and the survival mechanics of a broken domestic environment, They could not trust the radio, and they could not trust the cinema. They had to return to the physical theater. The stage responded to this immense cultural responsibility by becoming darker, vastly more realistic, and highly antagonistic toward the sanitized fictions of Hollywood. Playwrights intentionally began writing complex, legally dense domestic tragedies that were explicitly designed to be completely unadaptable for the screen. They saturated their scripts with highly specific legal jargon, detailed courtroom procedural maneuvers, and deep explorations of systemic judicial corruption, ensuring that the censors would never be able to untangle the narrative for mass consumption. The theater became an exclusive, highly intellectual echo chamber where the true trajectory of American jurisprudence was debated night after night, heavily insulated from the moral panic of the general public. However, the brilliant stage actors who were rapidly transitioning between the uncompromised Broadway theaters and the highly censored Hollywood soundstages discovered a phenomenal, entirely covert method to fight back against the establishment's ironclad code. They realized that while the censors could dictate every single word of the script, control the camera angles, and mandate the tragic endings, the administration could not legally regulate the internal psychological landscape of a highly trained theatrical performer. They could force the actress to speak the sanitized lines, but they could not control the precise manner in which those lines were delivered. What was this invisible, deeply subversive acting technique imported directly from the European stage that allowed these performers to completely undermine the mandatory moral lessons, silently communicating the necessity of legal reform to millions of viewers without ever breaking a single rule of the draconian censorship code? And how did this silent rebellion eventually crack the foundation of the fault-based legal system? This invisible, deeply subversive acting technique was the concept of subtext, a revolutionary psychological performance framework imported directly from the avant-garde European theater, specifically rooted in the early iterations of what would eventually become known as modern psychological realism. To understand how this completely dismantled the seemingly impenetrable censorship of the motion picture production code, we must analyze the fundamental vulnerability of the conservative establishment. The censors were bureaucrats, lawyers, and moral crusaders. They were absolute experts at reading ink on paper. They meticulously scrubbed every single page of a screenplay, crossing out any words that advocated for marital dissolution, deleting any dialogue that criticized family law, and strictly mandating that every script conclude with a legally sanctioned, fully reconciled marriage. But these bureaucrats completely failed to comprehend that human communication is vastly more complex than mere vocabulary. They controlled the text, but they had absolutely no jurisdiction over the subtext, which is the unspoken, internal, and often deeply contradictory emotional reality raging beneath the spoken words. The brilliant stage actors who migrated to the heavily monitored sound stages of Hollywood weaponized this exact blind spot to devastating effect. We can look at the case studies of the mandatory happy endings forced upon cinematic adaptations of progressive Broadway plays. The production code dictated that the female protagonist, after wrongfully attempting to seek an administrative separation, had to verbally repent, return to her husband, and declare her eternal devotion to the institution of marriage. The censors read this final scene on the page, stamped it with their official seal of approval, and believed they had secured a massive ideological victory. However, when the cameras rolled, the actress executed a masterful silent rebellion. She spoke the exact state-mandated words of surrender, but she played the physical and psychological reality of a hostage facing a life sentence. She would deliver the line about being thrilled to return to her domestic duties while her eyes remained hollow and dead. She would rigidly flinch when her cinematic husband placed a triumphant hand on her shoulder. Her voice, while speaking the approved vocabulary of reconciliation, would tremble with profound, suppressed trauma. She utilized micro-expressions, erratic breathing patterns, and defensive physical blocking to project absolute terror directly through the camera lens. This was an act of artistic genius and supreme political defiance. The actors were legally complying with the absolute letter of the censorship law, while simultaneously burning its spirit to the ground. They transformed the mandatory preservation of the fault-based marriage into a harrowing psychological horror story. Imagine if a modern citizen, Jane Doe, living in the current year 2026, requires an immediate exit from a profoundly toxic domestic environment. Today, Jane Doe possesses the immense structural advantage of utilizing standardized administrative frameworks, such as navigating a modern Divorce 661 procedure, allowing her to peacefully dissolve the partnership based on simple irreconcilable differences. She is seen by the modern court system as an autonomous legal entity capable of determining her own domestic safety. Now project Jane Doe back into the suffocating, highly censored cinematic audience of 1938. She is sitting in the dark, watching a film that the government promises is a morally uplifting tale of a saved marriage. But what she actually sees on the screen is a woman being systematically crushed by an inescapable legal system, forced into permanent domestic captivity by a state that refuses to grant her the fundamental human right of an administrative exit. The historical trends triggered by this mass deployment of subversive subtext were catastrophic for the conservative moral leagues. They had engineered the production code to convince the American public that strict, unbreakable marriage laws were the cornerstone of a healthy society. Instead, because of the actors' silent rebellion, the code accidentally broadcast the horrific potential outcomes of inescapable marriages to millions of viewers every single weekend. Audiences left the movie palaces not feeling morally fortified, but deeply disturbed, highly anxious, and profoundly empathetic toward characters who were trapped in legally enforced domestic misery. The cognitive dissonance between the happy words the actors were forced to speak and the absolute despair they physically portrayed shattered the polite fiction of the American family. This silent cinematic rebellion directly and permanently cracked the foundation of the fault-based legal system by fundamentally retraining the emotional intelligence of the American public, and by extension, the American jury pool. Because the masses spent decades watching brilliant actors silently communicate extreme psychological distress on screen, everyday citizens became highly adept at recognizing invisible domestic abuse. When actual family court cases went to trial in the mid-20th century, the rigid requirement to prove physical adultery or protracted desertion began to organically erode from within the courtrooms. Juries, primed by the psychological realism of the cinema, began heavily accepting extreme mental cruelty as a completely valid and devastating ground for legal separation. They no longer required a smoking gun or a staged hotel raid. They had been educated by the silver screen to look at the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, and the suppressed trauma of the plaintiff sitting on the witness stand. The theater had successfully incubated the concept of legal reform, and the actors had successfully smuggled that exact same concept past the most draconian federal censorship machine in history, beaming the undeniable necessity of administrative separation directly into the collective consciousness of the nation. By the middle of the 20th century, the cultural war had been decisively won. The public no longer believed in the sanctity of a legally forced marriage, and the immense social stigma surrounding marital dissolution had been critically, permanently wounded. The archaic legal frameworks were now operating entirely on borrowed time, completely out of sync with a society that desperately wanted the legal right to safely and peacefully walk away from a broken home. The massive cultural dam had suffered critical structural failure, and the waters of change were violently pressing against the crumbling concrete of the fault-based system. The stage and the screen had done everything in their immense power to prepare the United States for a complete structural revolution. But a cultural shift, no matter how profound or universally accepted, is not a binding legal statute. The ideas had to be physically dragged out of the movie palaces and the private theatrical clubs and hammered into the actual legislative architecture of the nation. The final fatal blow to the old world order was imminent. But how exactly did this massive, decades-long artistic campaign finally translate into the sweeping, undeniable legal codes we recognize today? What highly unexpected, radically progressive coalition mobilized in the late 1960s to deliver the final legislative strike? And how did their monumental victory officially birth the modern era of administrative dissolution, effectively ending the centuries-long theatrical war over the future of the American family? The final legislative strike that ultimately dismantled the centuries-old fortress of fault-based divorce was not delivered by a single activist or a solitary politician, but by a radically progressive bipartisan coalition that emerged from the social and political upheaval of the late 1960s. This coalition represented an extraordinary alignment of interests: feminist advocates demanding domestic autonomy, legal scholars seeking to end systemic perjury in the courtroom, and even conservative legislators who had come to realize that the state-mandated preservation of broken marriages was causing more social harm than good. They realized that the theatrical and cinematic battles of the previous 70 years had successfully prepared the soil, but the legal seeds had to be physically planted in the state capitals. This movement culminated in the 1969 passage of the Family Law Act in California, signed into law by then-Governor Ronald Reagan. This was the birth of no-fault divorce in the United States, a seismic legal shift that fundamentally transformed marriage from a state-controlled lifetime contract into a civil partnership that could be dissolved by mutual consent without the need to prove a villainous act. To understand the magnitude of this victory, we must analyze the step-by-step destruction of the old legal machinery. Before 1970, the legal system was designed to be a barrier. After 1970, the system began its slow evolution into a service. The requirement for a public trial, the necessity of professional actors to stage hotel raids, and the humiliating public testimony regarding infidelity were all systematically replaced by administrative procedures. This is the direct historical lineage of the modern administrative frameworks we see today. In current year 2026, a citizen like John Doe does not need a playwright to script his freedom. He needs a standardized set of forms and a clear understanding of jurisdictional requirements. This evolution is perfectly encapsulated in modern procedural identifiers like the Divorce 661, which represents the final stage of this long journey. The total transition of marital dissolution from a dramatic, high-stakes theatrical event into a streamlined bureaucratic process. Imagine if John Doe, navigating his separation in 2026, were suddenly forced to abide by the rules of 1920. He would be shocked to find that his mutual, peaceful agreement with his spouse was legally irrelevant. He would be horrified to learn that he had to hire a private investigator to fabricate evidence of a crime he did not commit. He would be devastated to realize that his entire professional reputation could be destroyed by a morality clause because he chose to end a relationship that no longer worked. The fact that John Doe finds these scenarios absurd is the ultimate proof of the theater's victory. The playwrights, the actors, and the labor unions of the early 20th century fought to make the legal reality of today seem like common sense. They fought to ensure that the state could no longer lock the fire exits on the American family. We must examine the historical trends that followed the national adoption of no-fault statutes throughout the 1970s and 80s. As the legal barriers fell, the theater did not stop talking about divorce. It simply changed its tone. The era of the grand, scandalous divorce play died because the scandal itself had been legislated out of existence. Instead, the stage began to explore the nuanced, domestic aftermath of separation. We saw the rise of the kitchen sink drama, focusing on the complexities of co-parenting, the division of shared assets, and the emotional labor of rebuilding a life. The theater moved from the courtroom to the living room. Case studies of plays from this era show a distinct shift in dialogue. The characters were no longer fighting for the right to leave, they were negotiating the terms of their new, independent futures. The legal victory in the legislature had freed the artists to explore the deeper, more human dimensions of the post-divorce experience. The data from this period is staggering. Within a decade of the California pivot, nearly every state in the Union had adopted some form of no-fault or administrative dissolution framework. This led to a predictable, temporary spike in filings as thousands of citizens who had been trapped for years in toxic environments finally utilized their new legal off-ramps. But beyond the numbers, the most significant change was the professionalization of the process. The rise of specialized paralegal services, mediation centers, and administrative assistance programs, all of which operate under specific procedural codes like the modern 661 frameworks, represented the final victory of the administrative over the adversarial. The theater had convinced the public that divorce was a social reality. The legislature had finally made it a manageable one. However, as we stand here in 2026, it is vital to recognize that this history is not merely a collection of dusty archives. The structural understanding of how these laws were won provides a critical lens for viewing current legal challenges. We see historical patterns repeating in the way modern media discusses emerging family structures, parental rights, and the intersection of technology and domestic law. The lessons of the theater syndicates, how to use subtext to bypass censorship, how to use labor strikes to protect personal autonomy, and how to use interstate commerce to force legal reform, remain the foundational strategies for any movement seeking social change. The fortress of the old world was not destroyed by a single blow, but by decades of persistent, creative, and strategically brilliant artistic warfare. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we must reflect on the profound debt we owe to the nameless actors who were blacklisted, the playwrights who were arrested, and the stagehands who walked off the job to protect the message. They took a topic that was considered legally and morally radioactive, and they normalized it through the power of narrative. They proved that the stage is not just a place for escapism, but a vital laboratory for the future of the law. They ensured that when a citizen today seeks a Divorce 661, they are participating in an administrative process that was bought and paid for by a century of theatrical rebellion. The curtain has fallen on the era of the divorce mill, but the play continues in every courtroom and every household where the right to personal freedom is exercised. But the story of the American domestic landscape is never truly finished. While the battle for the right to dissolve a marriage has been won, a new and perhaps even more complex conflict is brewing on the horizon. As we move further into the 21st century, the very definition of a legal partnership is being challenged by technological advancements, artificial intelligence, and the global shift toward digital nomadism. The old jurisdictional boundaries that the migratory dramas once exploited are being rendered obsolete by a borderless, digital world. How will the legal system adapt when the participants in a domestic partnership are separated not by state lines, but by virtual realities? What happens when the next great theatrical revolution takes place not on Broadway, but in a decentralized metaverse? The next decade of family law promises to be even more disruptive than the last century, and the first signs of this coming storm are already appearing in the most unexpected places. If you think the battle for administrative divorce was intense, you are not prepared for the legal chaos that is currently being rehearsed in the dark corners of the digital frontier.